Welcome into the Fantasy Football Diagnostics Podcast, where we provide you with your weekly diagnosis of everything fantasy football. Whether it's season-long leagues, dynasty, DFS, or sometimes even IDP, we got you covered all year long. Next guest, somebody I met in the community a while back. They are one of the three co-hosts for the Fantasy Fringe podcast and YouTube channel. He is one of these co-hosts, like I mentioned, Andrew of the Fantasy Fringe. Andrew, thank you for coming on, man, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I just got my coffee ready. Ready to talk some Cardinal football.
You're talking coffee. I'm talking about getting ready to go to sleep. I mean, that's what a 3-hour time difference will do to you. And so hopefully I can match your energy because I have not had any coffee. And, after we record this podcast, I'm going to go pack because I have a trip tomorrow morning. So this ought to be a fun evening. Maybe I'll need some coffee. But definitely somebody who probably will, I guess you just said you're going to have coffee. So you've had coffee. So maybe you don't need any right now, but you're probably juiced up about the topic today because we're talking NFC West. And anybody who's heard up to this part knows that there's only one team left in the NFC West, and that is Andrew York, Arizona Cardinals. They finished third in the NFC West with a record of 8-8 in 2020. They were a media darling, football prognosticators all summer. Kyler Murray was talked about as a dark horse MVP candidate. And while they took a step forward from the 5-11 year that they had the year prior, I think expectations were probably higher for the Cardinals in 2020 than what really happened. Entering year 3 of the Cliff Kyler combination, Andrew, what are the expectations for the Cardinals in 2021?
Yeah, so expectations are kind of difficult to rein in right now, right, for the Cardinals, because I do believe that they're a great team, but they're also in the toughest division in football. So they have to go up against the Rams and the Seahawks and the 49ers, which are all great teams. And I feel like each one of those teams could win the division, and each one of them could finish last in the division. So that's kind of tough. But when you look at Kyler Murray, right, because you brought that up, the year 1 to year 2 was actually a big jump. And I know he slumped at the end, but that was a shoulder injury, and you could tell that he wasn't running as much, and he wasn't able to throw the ball down the field very often. He had a really low yards per attempt at, what was it, like 7? Yeah, 7.1. So it was not a good yards per attempt for this season. But going into 2021, I have high expectations because not just what they did on the offense, but what they've done on the defense, especially if they get Chandler Jones re-signed. I know there's an issue with that right now, but I'm just going to say he's on the team, and with J.J. Watt on the other side, that could be nasty.
Yeah, so I mean, I think about this defense more and more. They have made some serious improvements on that defensive line. I mean, the secondary still has some questions, but they improved that defensive line. Hopefully, the thought there is that secondary improves as a result. You add Zaven Collins as well to your linebacking core. I know some people question that pick and that fit, but he's still a talented player that you're adding to your front seven. And then you also have Isaiah Simmons, who's returning from last year as well. The Swiss Army safety linebacker can kind of do it all. Chess piece there for the Arizona Cardinals on defense. I think, I think they can definitely make that step forward. I know you talked about the division where they could finish from a divisional standpoint, and I think I agree with you that any one of these teams could really finish first, and any one of them could finish last. But for the Cardinals, like you talked about, Kyler Murray, he's the focal point. Like I mentioned before, dark horse MVP candidate around the summertime. And boy, did he pay off for fantasy managers because he came out of the gate on fire. 11 straight games last year, 11 straight weeks of at least 20 fantasy points to start the year. Did fade down the stretch, like you talked about with the shoulder injury that he picked up in week 11 against Seattle. On the year, though, completed 67% of his passes for 3,971 yards. Also threw 26 touchdowns to just 12 interceptions. He was a monster on the ground, though, 819 rushing yards and 11 rushing touchdowns. overall, he was the QB3 in total fantasy points per game, behind Mahomes and Josh Allen. And is there anything about the price tag here that you're questioning with Kyler Murray? And I just want to add, just one point. He was actually on pace for just 10 yards short of the 1,000-yard season if you look at just the 11 games in which he wasn't injured. But Andrew, is there anything here about the price tag that you're questioning with Josh with a sorry, did I say well, he was the QB3 in total fantasy points per game, 23.7 points per game, but going off the board is the QB3 behind Allen and Mahomes. Is there anything here that makes you question the price tag with Kyler Murray?
No, actually, Kyler Murray is going around the fifth round right now, and I think that is the sweet spot for running back or for quarterback. Sorry, in fantasy drafts, because we see this shift happening where, we used to be late round quarterback all the time, but now those top end guys you want so bad. I mean, you look at DFS last year, and all the people in DFS wanted Patrick Mahomes, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, one of those dominant guys on their team, Lamar Jackson, especially at the end of the year. Lamar was killing it. But Kyler, I think he could be number one quarterback again this year. He was the number one quarterback leading into his injury. So I do see that happening, especially if you look at what the Cardinals have done. They've kind of shown their hand, right? They went out and they said, we don't need a high volume running back. We don't need it. We're just going to throw the ball. So we'll get AJ Green and we'll bring in Rondale Moore. So that's just going to help Kyler Murray. They're just because they are second right now in pace of play. So they run a ton of plays. And that's what, alludes to fantasy points is pace of play. And last year they were running the ball at a 56% rate. Well, if that transitions to a 40% rate and they're throwing the ball at a 60% rate, that just means Kyler Murray is going to be awesome for fantasy.
Yeah, I think, there's no reason why he can't be awesome again. He was injured, obviously. That impacted how he was playing down the stretch. He would have had well over the 4,000 yards had he not suffered the injury. Was on, again, I've referenced these first 10 games through those first 11 weeks, but he was on pace for 4,200 yards, 30 passing touchdowns, and 13 interceptions. And he was on pace of he was getting a touchdown a game, which is unlikely to happen. But when they get down by the goal line, Kyler Murray was the red zone weapon. And I think that right there alone is worth having Kyler Murray on your team, because the fact that he 11 rushing touchdowns last year is absolutely an absurd number for a quarterback. Absurd.
Absolutely. He is so good down at the red zone. He's such a threat. That RPO is amazing down there. He's amazing at it. He's so quick. He has that shiftiness to him that you just know that he's going to get 8+ rushing touchdowns every single year. You can just bank on it.
I've had a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, Sonny Platt, host of the Big Knowledge Football Fantasy Podcast. He one time said he said to me once that Kyler Murray, when he thinks about he likes to think about how many players does a player need to play a football game. How many other players would they need? And he said Kyler Murray could probably play a football game by himself. Ever since he said it, I can't get it out of my head. But let's move on to the running back position, man. And Kenyon Drake no longer on the team since moving on to Las Vegas, but he was the leading rusher in 2020 in terms of carries, 239, and yards at 955 to go along with 10 touchdowns. Was the RB24 in PPR points per game at 12.8. Then there's Chase Edmonds, who returns after being the RB35 in PPR points per game at 10.5. He was third on the team in rushing with 448 rushing yards on 133 attempts. Also added 53 catches for 402 yards and 4 touchdowns on about 67 targets. There are some concerns with Edmonds, about him potentially being a lead back, but we did see him be a lead back against the Giants 2 years ago, where he had 30 touches, also had a 28 touch day against the Dolphins in 2020. So I think the coaching staff has put him in those positions at times. Then there's James Conner, who was brought in this year. He profiles more as the workhorse back from a body type and a history perspective. He was the RB25 last year in PPR points per game at 12.7. Connor has typically gotten a bad rep for, mainly because of his inability to stay healthy. I think some assume that he'll be the guy because, again, of his history of being a guy that can quote unquote handle a large workload week in and week out. But with his injury history, it's hard to say if he actually can. As it currently stands, Edmonds has an ADP, according to 4for4.com's multi-site ADP, of RB24. James Conner has an ADP of RB38. How are you approaching this one, Andrew?
Yeah, so both of these guys I'm not super excited about going in, but it depends on your draft strategy, honestly. For me, if I'm trying to do the zero RB strategy, which I more times than not do not do this strategy, but if I am, Chase Edmonds and James Conner are targets. And it just depends on which one you believe in more. If you believe James Conner is going to come in and he's going to vulture all the touchdowns, which I actually do not prescribe to that. I know a lot of people will because he's a bigger back, but Kyler Murray's down there and Chase Edmonds is actually good down at the red zone. He's Kamara-esque, not Kamara. I don't want to get anybody confused and think I'm saying he's Alvin Kamara. I'm saying just down at the red zone, they can run those same type of plays, and that's where Chase Edmonds scores, actually. So I don't see James Conner doing a whole lot other than just, I guess, change of pace guy. That's what he is now. He's older and not too old, but his body's old. He's gone through so much in his life. So I just see him coming in and getting like maybe 10 touches. And then Chase Edmonds, he's going to probably get around, 15 to 20 touches between the rushing and the passing game.
Yeah, I think at one point last year we saw this backfield get to a point where Kenyon Drake was just getting all the carries, no receptions, and Chase Edmonds was getting most of the receptions, and he'd get some work in the carry department. And maybe you see a similar thing like that here with James Conner. I'm with you, man. I mean, Chase Edmonds, to me, he's the guy that I would want. He's the guy that I prefer. James Conner, I mean, I always have this saying here on the Fantasy Football Diagnostics podcast, but life, death, taxes, and James Conner getting injured in a primetime game.
That's
Those
right.
things are guaranteed in life. And
That's
so,
right. Yes.
so it just I don't know when the Cardinals have a primetime game, but I would put money that we probably see James Conner tweak an ankle or a knee or something, and Chase Edmonds breaks out for like 30 carries or something like that, and then. But I think this could be a frustrating situation all season, right? We saw it be a frustrating situation at points with David Johnson and his injuries. And so I think, even last year, like I said, we saw it fluctuate a little bit. If both guys are healthy, it's probably going to be a pain in the butt. But if James Conner does James Conner things and somehow misses a game because of some kind of soft tissue injury or something, I think Chase Edmonds will have very useful weeks. And so, from your perspective, like you were saying, zero RB strategy, I'm not one that subscribes to that. But if I did, Chase Edmonds is definitely on my radar.
Yeah, he'd definitely be a target for me. And I might do a couple drafts this year just to see how the zero RB strategy works. I have done it in the past, but it's been a few years. But this year is creeping up to seem like that might be a winning strategy again. There are some late round guys that I like this year, and Chase Edmonds is one of them. I don't like him for how high he's going, but I mean, right at the back end of the RB2, I'm okay with it. I can be okay with it.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any. I just want to say that I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with doing zero RB. I actually think that I've been in drafts where I've had to do zero RB because that was the way my draft fell. And so I think that obviously you have to kind of draft to your, the way your room is, because what happens if you're picking 12 and the first 11 picks are running back? So you're going to take the 12th running back, or would you rather have the first wide receiver? I don't know. But let's move on to the wide receivers because we're talking about them. And DeAndre Hopkins was traded from Houston to Arizona, and many thought he would struggle a bit because of the quarterback change. There was a thought that while there was some data that supported some of the narrative that we've rarely seen quarterback or wide receivers switch teams and then be successful, but we've rarely seen a player as good as DeAndre Hopkins or a head coach slash general manager in the salary cap era as dumb as Bill O'Brien. But anyway, D Hop gets 28 to 30% of the targets wherever he pretty much goes, or I mean whatever team he's been on, no matter the receivers that were around him. Pretty much that's what he's going to get. So naturally, got 160 targets, which led the Cardinals by more than 80 targets. He actually saw more targets than Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald combined, and they were second and third on the team respectively. He turned that into 115 catches, 1,407 yards, and 6 touchdowns, finishing as the wide receiver 4 in total fantasy points, 18 fantasy points per game. Has some more competition in terms of targets this year, but should still see north of 140 targets. Going off the board currently as the wide receiver 4. How we feel about D Hop at his price, Andrew?
Yeah, I think he's priced right. Right there, wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5. I think that's where Hopkins deserves to be. I understand that there are a lot of wide receivers in Arizona right now, but we'll talk about AJ Green, but Rondale Moore, how much of an impact is he really going to make year one? I love Rondale Moore. I was a huge fan of him coming out of college, and I think he's going to be special. But as a rookie, he's going to be playing sparingly. He's not going to be in there all the time, I don't believe. I do believe by the end of the season, he could be the wide receiver 2 on this team, but that's going to take time. Christian Kirk, I think he's going to be going into the slot, which will be great for him. But Hopkins is still the number 1 guy, and Kyler and him have a connection already, and it's just going to build this year. So the only thing I would say is that his touchdowns could regress upward, and he could have double-digit touchdowns. That's possible. His yards and whatnot, I think he's right there, 12 to 1,400 yards. His target share is going to be roughly the same. So I'm in on Hopkins this year, and I think wide receiver 4, I'm cool with it. I would probably be wide receiver 5, but that's picking hairs.
Yeah, I initially put my projections out back in June 1st, and I think I had gotten like not eviscerated. This is the wrong word, but a lot of people were upset with where I had DeAndre Hopkins in terms of my wide receivers. I think at the time I had him at like right outside my top 10, which was, I admit, was kind of low at the time. I've since moved him up to 7, but it's not because I think he's going to be any worse, or it's not because I don't have faith in the Cardinals. I actually just really like the additions that they've made at the wide receiver position, and so I think that he will still see the significant amount of targets. He will still lead the team in targets. I have him with 149 targets, so it's going to be okay. But I do agree with you. I think the touchdowns do go up because you can't score. You can't have that many yards and that many targets and only have 6 touchdowns. Very hard to do that, and so I think we do see double-digit touchdowns from him. I mean, Kyler Murray is not going to score a rushing touchdown a game again. There's got to be some of that touchdown production has to come from somewhere. But we talked about the wide receiver 2 a little bit. There are a few guys here that kind of fit the mold in terms of a wide receiver 2 in terms of fantasy production that we could target on this team. AJ Green, he was brought over from Cincinnati. Now had this duo been put together maybe 3-4 years ago, we'd be talking about probably one of the best duos of all time in terms of wide receivers. But both a bit older, especially AJ Green, who enters his age 33 season. He had the unforgettable season with the Bengals where he had a career low in receiving yards at 523, also 2 touchdowns with a major career low catch rate at 45%. He was the wide receiver 68 in PPR points per game at 7 points per game. Seemed to really fall off a cliff in Cincinnati. I think he does kind of fit into this Cardinal scheme where the wide receivers seem to have a bit of a lower A dot. Then enter also Christian Kirk, who you previously mentioned. He's flashed at times in big ways, but just hasn't been able to really string it together with any consistency. 14 games last year, he turned 79 targets and 48 receptions for 621 yards and 6 touchdowns, finishing as a wide receiver 51. And then last but definitely not least, you talked about him before. I'm absolutely in love with the dude, but that's Rondale Moore. drafted in the second round out of Purdue. I think he is a phenomenal fit for this offense. Just when you consider again, they run a lot of screens, getting players in space, and I think he also provides an element of a deep passing game that I think the Cardinals were trying to get out of Andy Isabella, which hasn't quite been there with much consistency. In terms of ADP, Andrew, AJ Green's the wide receiver 61, Kirk is the wide receiver 74, and Moore is the wide receiver 80. How are you kind of attacking the wide receiver 2 or 3 position in Arizona, if you are at all?
Yeah, mostly I'm staying away from all the rest of the receivers other than Hopkins in Arizona. And it's not to say that AJ Green and Christian Kirk cannot be wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4s. It's just going to be, they're better best ball players to me. Because the thing is, you're not going to know when they hit and when they miss. And when they miss, they can miss to be zeros. And it depends on how you go about your draft. Some people are okay with, boom bust guys. Others, you want in there to be that solid player. And I do have boom bust guys, but they're not these ones, if that makes sense. AJ Green is, wide receiver 61. Take him, see what happens. You can drop him. Those are always, you're going to find out what he is, game 1, game 2. So he's the easy drop candidate if he's no good. Christian Kirk, I would be more inclined to take him than I would AJ Green or Rondale Moore, just because I think that he's been miscast in Arizona for so long because of Larry Fitzgerald being there, that this year he might actually play his natural position in the slot. And that could be really, really good things for Christian Kirk. Rondale Moore, we were talking about, I really like him. He's a great prospect, but fantasy wise, year 1, you don't have to draft him. He's not probably going to do anything the first 8 weeks of the season, and he's going to be on that waiver wire when it is that he pops off. And then just spend your fab on him. Because you don't want a guy that you're just holding on your roster. We're talking redraft here and not dynasty league. So in redraft, you do not want these guys just clogging your roster. It's not worth it. Just pick them up when it's time.
Yeah, or pro tip here, you could the Cardinals play the later games typically. So me being on the East Coast, I have I don't know, uh I'm just gonna say random running back Ty Johnson. Ty Johnson, I have him on my team for the 1 o'clock games, and I see he hasn't done anything, and so I'll if the format allows, I'll drop him. And right before that 4 o'clock game, I'm like, oh hey, let me pick up Rondell Moore. Maybe this game's the game. And so that way you don't have to spend the
Exactly.
fab. But I'm definitely into that idea because I think Rondell Moore can make an impact later as the season progresses, like you said earlier. Christian Kirk moving back into the slot, that's not something I've really thought about. But when you honestly think about it, Christian Kirk is better suited as a slot receiver. I mean, he can play some on the outside, but I think to your point, you want him in the slot. And so I think
Absolutely.
with Larry Fitzgerald moving on, I think that's actually a pretty good buy low candidate there. That's interesting. I haven't really thought about that all that much. But, we know that Cardinals run a lot of what we call 10 personnel. We've
Right.
seen them run quite a bit. They run a lot of 3 wide receiver sets as well, but 10 personnel means there's no tight end on the field. Um, we saw last year Dan Arnold, he was 5th on the team with targets, 31 catches, 438 yards, 4 touchdowns. I'm pretty sure I think the Cardinals have Max Williams and Daryl Daniels on the roster. According to 444's ADP, neither of these guys is getting drafted. Does the tight end position exist in Arizona from a fantasy standpoint?
No, Max Williams is a good run blocker, and that's it. And that's okay because that's why they kind of brought in AJ Green. They have another big guy. They're fine without a tight end. This offense doesn't need a pass catching tight end.
Yeah, I mean I agree with you. I think they could literally go the whole season without playing a tight end, and nobody would even bat an eye. I mean, obviously you'd play a tight end, but without utilizing the tight end in any significant way, I don't think anybody would bat an eye. Um, Andrew, man, this was awesome, brother. But before I end this one and let you go, man, I gotta ask you, how is this division breaking down, and where are the Cardinals going to finish in it?
Oh, put me on the spot, huh? Okay. So, the Arizona Cardinals end the season 10 wins. So, I'm taking the over.
Okay, so where does that get them in terms of the division? Is that going to put them at
Number 2.
number 2 in the division? Okay,
Number
behind.
2. Behind the Rams.
Okay, okay. I think you are you're 2 of 4 that have picked the Rams to win this division. I think you're the highest on the Cardinals, which I'm not going to call you out for being biased potentially at all. But I have a question. I mean, maybe you can write me, right? Because I've had this theory, and I love Cliff Kingsbury going into last year. I thought that some of the adjustments that he made in 2019 showed that he wasn't going to be one of those coaches that was stuck in his old ways, that
Yeah.
wasn't stuck in his college ways, and was going to adapt and learn. And then I kind of didn't see much of that in 2020. I thought that, I don't think that he's done a lot to help Kyler Murray from a play calling perspective. Um, and so I have questions and I've had reservations. I actually have the Cardinals finishing last in the division, and I've got them at their over under. The over under I have from earlier in the year is set at 8. I have them projected for the under here, and so because of that, I thought I've been on this mindset that Cliff Kingsbury is probably coaching his last season with the Cardinals. But it seems like, am I off track with that line of thinking, Andrew?
To be honest, even if they come in and miss the playoffs again, I don't see this as Cliff Kingsbury's last season. And I know that the NFL likes to just recycle all of these different coaches one after another if they don't take them to the playoffs, but I don't see that happening this time. I think Cliff Kingsbury has a few years left before he gets canned, and that Kyler Murray Cliff Kingsbury relationship means so much that it's hard to break that apart, I think. So
No,
I don't see it as like an end all be all. If they miss the playoffs this year, he's done. I do believe that he needs to open up the playbook a little bit more. But then again, Kyler was still, learning. Like you saw him as a rookie. Yeah, he made, some great things, but he also took a lot of sacks. He wasn't processing everything so quick. And then this past year, he still needs to process things quicker. And then I also notice, like, when I watch him, sometimes he thinks too fast and he doesn't let the play fully develop. And then other times he does the opposite. So he's still learning also. He has the potential of being one of the great quarterbacks that we talk about, 10 years from now. But he was only in the league for 2 years. And same with Cliff. He's only been there 2 years. So I think we have a few years left.
yeah, and a lot of that comes from, I guess, me thinking that, hey, you come in here, you convince them that they don't have to draft. They can get rid of this quarterback that they drafted the year before. And obviously Kyler Murray's been a great talent, but it's resulted in like 13 wins in 2 years. And I guess my thought was that if they don't make the playoffs, it's hard to go 3 years in a row, not make the playoffs and still keep your job. But I definitely do hear what you're saying. Definitely makes a ton of sense. And hopefully, I'm rooting for the Cardinals, man. I'm rooting for Kyler Murray. I think he's phenomenal, and I want him to really develop into one of these top quarterbacks in the league. So definitely want nothing but the best for him, and hopefully the Arizona Cardinals. We know the NFC West is going to be fun, and so let's
It's gonna be tough.
it's going to be a tough one, but hey, man, hopefully my New York Jets helped you out by bringing Robert Saleh over, help maybe weaken a division rival. Although Arizona gives it to San Fran, and Kyler Murray specifically gives it to San Fran when they play. So
They do.
that would be an interesting one anyway. But Andrew, man, I appreciate you, brother. Why don't you let everybody know what it is that y'all got cooking over at Fantasy Fringe? and where they can follow you and all your work and everything else you guys got going on.
Yeah, so make sure to follow me on Twitter at Andrew_Fringe. And then you can also find the Unicorn on Twitter at Unicorn_Fringe. And we are actually coming back to the scene of podcasting. We took a break during the off season. We do that just to regroup, and we've been, remodeling the house and everything. But we will be back actually this weekend. This is our first podcast back for the season, and I appreciate you bringing us on for this. And we'll have an episode out on Monday.
Well, would you look at that? I feel so honored. Your first podcast of the season, and let's call it the warm up before we bring you guys
That's right.
back in on Monday. So make sure you check out Fantasy Fringe. Make sure you go check out Andrew, and make sure you go check out the Unicorn as well. Both phenomenal people, phenomenal analysts, and their show is great and definitely a good time. So you definitely want to check that out. And everybody, we appreciate y'all for listening and hope you enjoyed it. Make sure y'all catch us next week when we go over the AFC West. Peace, y'all.